There we are. We restarted our recording, and I do welcome everyone tonight to our Building Trust, Authenticity, Competence, and Performance webinar. My name is David Corcoran, and I am the EQ Professionals Manager here at 6 Seconds in Europe. And so tonight, for the next 55 minutes or so, we're really going to jump into this idea of trust, what it is, how we can use it. And I see here some of the people who are joining us, our attendees, have already started their 6 seconds journey, which is fantastic. Some are already certified since 2017. That's fantastic too. So you may already know a lot more about trust, but I also encourage you to share your voices on tonight's recording and also for this webinar, for the sake of all of us together. So for those who don't know, 6 Seconds is a global emotional intelligence network, and we have a noble goal of having 1 billion people practicing EQ by 2039. And a noble goal is something that will take a long time, perhaps many lifetimes to achieve. And 2039 is the 100th birthday of our founder, Annabelle Jensen. And so we're looking forward to that moment. We have served over 9.7 million people in our certifications alone. But tonight, you form part of that 1 billion people really understanding a little bit more about emotional intelligence and being able to practice emotional intelligence in your life. At 6 Seconds, as you can see on screen, we do a number of different things, really around assessments, learning to understand emotional intelligence, measuring it, and growing it. So learn, measure, and grow. We're in 190 plus countries. We have all sorts of reports that can help you to understand. And I'm going to show you a couple of models from a couple of those reports tonight. We do things in many different languages, as it says there, 27 different languages. And we have many other books and tools that may be useful to you. Our YouTube channel is also vibrant, full of materials that you might want to go back to and have a look, both for 6 Seconds Europe and for our 6 Seconds Global YouTube channels as well. So I welcome you to certainly dive a little bit deeper into emotional intelligence, whether you're certified like some are, or whether you're a newbie, as some of you are as well. These are some of the models that we have, our KCG model, our TFA model, and our change map. But certainly one of the maxims that we hold true is that emotions drive people and people drive performance. So we want you to consider, how are your emotions driving you? You as a person, you as a leader in an organization, perhaps in a family unit, in a relationship, as a couple. And how does that drive your performance? So how are you using your emotions to help steer you in life? I myself started as one of our persons here tonight did in 2017 myself with a practitioner course, and that led on to various other certification that I've taken and now being a staff member of 6 Seconds Europe. But you see there, community is also a strong part of what we want to encourage, and we welcome you tonight to this webinar, to our community. And we do want to have people all over the world understanding, practicing, and using emotional intelligence. Welcome to those who have just joined us. Tonight's webinar is on trust. So let's move into that content tonight. And I'd like to ask you, please use the chat as we go along. I'd like to interact with you as best as I can with this technology. When you think of trust as a word, what do you think of? I've put a few suggestions here on the screen, but I'd like you to think about, what does it mean to you as a word? On the left-hand side, some collocations. I also do a lot of language teaching. And so we can earn trust with people. We talk about building trust. We have bonds of trust. Trust was betrayed. We all know what distrust perhaps feels like as well. And so when we use the word a lack of trust, I had a lack of trust in my employer, or trust was betrayed when. Chris, you've said here credibility comes to mind. Absolutely. You could add that word to my list of words here on the other side. So I looked up synonyms for trust, and we get trustworthy, confidence, expectation, faith, hope, and competence. Credibility. I love that. And Eric, you've said words equal actions. Absolutely. Karen says respect plays a role, 100%. Mensa says trust is a fundamental element of thriving relationships. Thank you. And Uraya Kuma, if I hope I've said your name right, trust is an integral value-based competence in practice. Yes, so trust is something that we do want to do. I don't know if you've heard of Esther Perel. She's a relationship psychologist, and she talked about love being a verb, and that to love and be in love is one thing, but to act on and practice love is another. And it got me thinking as I was preparing this webinar on trust to think about, yeah, how can we then build trust? And I looked up trust in the dictionary, Cambridge Dictionary, in fact, and there's two forms. It's a noun, the belief that something is true, although you have no proof. So think about the things that you have absolute trust in, but perhaps no physical proof of, or no tangible, moments where you can say without a doubt, but you have trust. Sometimes we form trust with people very easily. What goes into that? Trust is also a verb. It says to believe that someone is good and honest and will not harm you, or that something is safe and reliable. And I made some of those words bold for that reason. It's a belief. It's something we hold true within ourselves. It's also therefore a feeling that we have. And tonight, in terms of building trust, that's the angle that we're looking at, that trust is something that through emotional intelligence, we can really strive to understand more. As you've said here, Scott, trust builds over time and must start with ourselves before we learn to give it to others. Exactly. Can I trust myself? And do I trust others? 100%. So it's about our own feeling of safety and reliability, that belief that we hold, ourselves to be true in a situation as well. One of the definitions that we have from our vital signs model that we'll explore a little bit later is that it is a feeling of confidence and surety. So this within the model, this is within a business sense, says that it's that confidence and surety. So when we go to work or in a professional situation, do I have that assurance that I'm going to be able to go forward in the best possible way, that our company will continue on, and that I can do the best work that I can as well, trusting in that idea. And we have words like psychological safety. Chris, we're going to talk about the VS model. It stands for Vital Signs Model, and I'm going to introduce you to that a little bit later. Thanks for pointing that out. The last thing and the question is, how can we increase trust at work? And so really tonight is around authenticity, competence, and performance. And so really diving into each of those areas in terms of how do we understand what we can do. And I call on you all a little bit later to share some ideas. I've come up with a few and researched a few different TED Talks that are going to give us some other ideas, as well as some of the literature that we have within our 6 seconds canon. And we really do have a lot of information on different topics, but all about emotions. So to get started, I want to have a look at a couple of TED Talks that I did look at. The first being from Frances Frey, who's a Harvard business professor, and she says that there are 3 components to trust in her TED Talk. And I thought these were really interesting. And the fact that we'd also highlighted that authenticity is a strong part of our methodology here, starting with ourselves. Be yourself. And I think it's one thing to say, well, just be authentic. I do a lot of voice coaching, as I mentioned before. I'm a former opera singer. And so I do voice coaching with people. And they say, but I want to be authentic. But if you're using your voice and you're saying the words that you want to say, how is that not authentic? So what she suggests in the TED Talk is really understanding, when do we be ourselves and when do we not? And when we think about the workplace, we're often putting on a mask. Sometimes we can discover through assessments and things that actually our preference is for a different direction. But in the workplace, we're called upon to be someone different or to play that game. So she strongly suggests that in order to be more trustworthy and to develop trust, to be yourself. She talks about rigor in logic. And what this means is that we have to have quality arguments. So when we're describing what we describe, or when we're doing the work we do, we need to ensure that it's of a specific quality. And she talks later in the talk about wobbles. And so if any of these areas are wobbling, then we don't have trust. The last she talks about is empathy. And empathy, she says, is the easiest thing to wobble. And empathy, we're going to talk about later in terms of our own model, is about, yes, putting yourself in the shoes of others, but also feeling the feels. It's also thinking ahead and maybe moving towards empathic action with people where we're not stuck in those feelings, but we're also just not cognitively thinking about empathy or I think about it and so therefore it is. We've got to go a little bit deeper than that. And she mentions here that empathy can develop when we stop distracting ourselves. So I don't know about you, but when we're in work meetings, we're constantly distracted. An email pops up or a text message. How often are we putting everything aside and being able to just be present and focused on others? And so what she's saying here is that in order to build trust with people, we need to forget these wobbles that could come in, or we need to work with the wobbles and work on being less distracted, having quality arguments, and being ourselves in the workplace. I think her story is quite interesting. I've put the sources there at the bottom, but certainly if you put in Frances Frey, then you'll get her TED Talk on trust. Likewise, Simon Sinek talks about trust, and he uses a graph. Maybe you've seen it, the trust matrix. And I thought this was really important to share. And he's done a lot of work with the Navy SEALs. And this is how he came up with this model, where we have performance on one side and trust on the other. And he says that no one wants to work with anyone who's low performance and low trust. We simply, probably wouldn't put ourselves in that position. But what about people in high positions and high performance and high trust? We love those people, but those are a rarity. He said what happens most of the time is that we work with high performers, but we have low trust. And through his work, he discovered that in fact, many organizations, including the Navy SEALs, would rather work with people with mid performance and high trust, or even low performance and high trust. So he talks about the fact that high performance and low trust. He talks about those people that in any organization, if you ask who are the high performers but the low trust, the people who are really toxic, and he said these are the toxic people within your organization. He said they all point to the same person usually when he asks a team of people. So perhaps we know who these low trust performers are. He said businesses and organizations work a lot on performance. We can measure it, they quantify it, they strategize on it, but they do very little in terms of measuring trust. And that's what we can introduce you to tonight through a couple of different measures in our assessments that actually look at understanding trust as an emotion, but as something that we can use in our workplaces as well. And Karen, you've said here, even when we are authentic, we play different roles in our lives. We're a partner, a parent, a sister, a daughter, a colleague, a boss. Absolutely. This different hats idea. I think it was Edward de Bono who talked about different hats in life. So think about the amount of trust that we have there with people. And just makes me think actually of Stephen Covey, who talked about an emotional bank account with people. Think of it like a trust bank account. So we need to make small deposits with different people regularly, with our spouses, with our kids. And of course, there'll be moments where we don't always have their trust, or we do something that perhaps erodes trust. And so there's a withdrawal from that bank account. But if the bank account is nice and healthy, then perhaps those withdrawals don't empty the account. So same here with Simon Sinek's trust matrix. He talks about the fact that we'd rather have mid performance but high trust. So trust being a true metric of understanding. I think this is quite an interesting idea that certainly, again, go deeper on and hear his words because I'm just referring to them. But this idea of measuring performance and trust in your organizations, within your relationships and environments. So try not to be that toxic high performer, but low trust person. Person you wouldn't trust perhaps to with money or with a particular motivation to mind your kids, perhaps look after your car for the weekend. High on ego, low on empathy. Absolutely. So when we put these two together, Karan, we see then that empathy and authenticity could lead to those low trust situations as well. And empathy really is one of these factors that I've seen across all these different talks that I've been looking at as well. At 6 seconds, we have the business case for emotional intelligence. It's a document that we've put out, and certainly you can read more. I'm going to pop the direction here into the chat for you, so you can take a look for yourselves if you'd like. And the business case really highlights through studies, and it's a white paper that we've produced. We re-released it just last year. And a couple of comments that I've grabbed from this particular case sort of say it all for me. When we have poor trust and poor communication, this leads to lower productivity and engagement. And for me, this is the key word, communication. How are we communicating that we can be trusted? How are we communicating within our organizations? The work talks about the fact that trust predicted 72.53% of variance in overall performance outcomes among individual team members. So in other words, higher trust, then we've got higher performance. Teams that experience joy were 10 times as likely to be high achieving and satisfied with their work. And if you go deeper into that paper and also into our vitality report, which was published in 2022, and I'll pop that also in the chat for you. For those watching onto this recording, you can go to our website and type in workplace vitality or business case for emotional intelligence, and you'll receive those same reports. 10 times as likely. So joy in this case is not that, oh, I'm overjoyed for being at work today. You know, my work brings me joy, but that feeling of joy, celebration, communication, having moments where we're truly feeling like turning up to work. How many of you feel like turning up to work? How many of you work in a high trust, high performance kind of environment where you feel respected and understood, where you can be your authentic self while wearing the hat that you're wearing within your organization? And finally, here it says organizations that prioritize emotional intelligence are 22 times likely to be high performing. So we know from our 25 years of existing at 6 seconds and through the various studies that we've been doing since 2011 and 2013 that organizations that prioritize emotional intelligence are more likely to be high performing. And we've worked with pharmaceutical companies, with large tech companies, other finance and banking organizations as well. We've got many different case studies on our website. But there seems to be a trend that when we implement and understand emotional intelligence, we can really start to build. Emotions are even more important predictors these days of the outcomes that we're facing and the challenges that we're facing. A lot of the challenges that we face are emotionally intelligent ones, meaning that we can use our emotional intelligence to help us out here as well. Let's have a look then at one of our key models, as I mentioned, and you saw it before, the KCG model. And some of you who are watching tonight who have already invested in 6 seconds and understand this model might also think about how are you, and share with us, how are you increasing empathy? The model itself, just for those who are new and don't know, is broken into 3 sections. It's all about awareness, know yourself, intention, choose yourself, and direction, give yourself. And you see here the blue, the red, and the green. So the blue section, know, awareness, is all about pausing for reflection or seeing what am I getting back. And there are 2 competencies which are about our emotional literacy. So how many emotions can you name? And also recognizing those patterns in your life. When we gain that awareness of ourselves, then we can look at choose yourself, which is really about stopping and assessing, where do I go from here? It's about that direct self-direction that we might have. It's about thinking, or self-management, I should say. It's about thinking, in which direction should I go and what consequences do I have when I move in that direction? And that's what consequential thinking is all about. Likewise, how do we navigate the waters? And so trust, I think goes up and down. We don't always have high trust and high performance. So there will be moments where that changes and shifts, but how can we navigate those waters? Likewise, with intrinsic motivation or internal motivation, the inner drive that comes from us, as well as optimism. This is all in the choose yourself section. In green, we have give yourself, which is where empathy falls. This is where tonight we're talking about these skills to enhance trust. And as we said before, empathy becomes a big part of that. There are a number of ways we're going to talk about shortly about how to increase empathy. But likewise, we think about a noble goal and pursuing a noble goal. There's a whole method behind developing a noble goal. But as I said before, it's 6 seconds. We have a noble goal as an organization of having 1 billion people practicing EQ by 2039. For me, it's about myself. I have a noble goal to create space for others to be better. And so what I mean when I enact on that is it helps me, it gets me out of bed, it moves me towards the direction and purpose for my life. And it's an overarching sense of helping me to make decisions in everyday life. And it's also about how and where I can build trust. So I play a little bit of music at the beginning to help us come into the mood of the moment, to help us to go forward in different ways and to really understand that my goals are important and that my work then serves towards that purpose as well. So Karen, you've asked a question, do you place healthy boundary setting under choose yourself in your system? Admittedly, we don't always talk about boundary settings within that context of how we know them now and really understanding where our boundaries are. But yeah, I'd say that that would fall in that area. Consequential thinking is about thinking ahead for the future, but it could also then apply to, well, where is my limit? Where is my level? Where am I ready to go towards? And then thinking or using the model, how do I feel about that? So in that moment, what emotions are coming up to me when I do boundary set there? Maybe quite it may give you some anxiety in order to set that boundary in that workplace, to stand up and say, no, this is where I need to go now. Certainly depending on our age and stage in life, they often say that generation Z coming into the workforce now are very clear in those boundaries, which is great. Perhaps we've needed that, whereas many of us older, I'm a generation X myself, we may have kind of moved and broken our own personal boundaries, therefore not being able to do that, and we're perhaps not trusting ourselves enough in that moment to stand up. So let's dive deeper here into empathy, which forms part of this give yourself. Give yourself is really about that direction, as I say, your North Star for life. It's about recognizing and responding appropriately to other people's emotions. You may have heard the term putting yourself in someone else's shoes. I have just finished a really interesting book that says, actually from neuroscience and psychology, that it's actually impossible to put yourself in someone else's shoes because you're always coming through the lens of yourself. But it's better than not doing anything. So it is about thinking, okay, how would this person respond? But one way to confirm, that's right, in the book, the author says, ask them. Ask them. So the book is You Have More Influence Than You Think by Vanessa Bombs, I think is her name. She's a professor at an American university, and she says that asking people, clarifying, understanding, and later on we talk about connection. Communication connection is about asking, inquiring, being curious, understanding what do we want to get out of a situation and how do others feel about that situation. If we haven't taken the time to really listen then as we're asking good questions, then this is where we're not building empathy. It helps us to gain that insight and trust and solve problems together. So maybe you felt those moments of trust in your own life when you've gone to ask somebody and they've said, yeah, let me help you. That's the whole premise of this book. She says that most of the time we don't realize that when we ask people to do something, they'll just do it for us. And we don't necessarily know why, but that forms part of this connection. So when we do ask, when we do take the time to pause and to go deeper with somebody, either cognitively or within that feeling sense, then we can gain new insights. And notice too that word trust. This is from our website, falls straight into that idea as well. So here's this word trust again popping up for us. And we're really looking at trust now as a competency. So we've gone from authenticity to competence, as we said in the title of this webinar. And maybe you've heard of the iceberg model, which is, I didn't want to have too many slides, but it's that idea where we have what we see above the surface, but also what's not spoken under the surface. And we need to consider what's under the surface for someone. So to build trust, especially if I'm a leader in an organization, I need to stop and recognize, okay, maybe I need to ask this person. Maybe I need to be aware of my own feelings towards them and maybe recognize what are their feelings towards me. How can I move and navigate this situation with them for the best interests and outcomes of everyone? It's not always that my voice needs to be the loudest. It actually needs to be the quietest. And we have two ears and one mouth for that reason. So we need to listen more than we speak. So looking beneath the surface could be considering, where is this person coming from? What other hats are they wearing? For instance, how well do you know your fellow employees? How well do you know if you're a manager, your direct reports? Have you taken the time and invested with those people? And do you connect with them on a daily basis to understand what might be going on for them? And this is how we can understand what's underneath the surface as well for people. So here's a key idea already for you to take away. Listen to hear and not to respond. This comes from our coaching program. And certainly when I developed my own coaching skills, I really had to understand that, because most of the time, and I'd still say now, a lot of the time, I'm listening to respond. I'm listening to appear smart. I'm not really practicing, that moment to just stop and reflect and to put myself in someone else's shoes. And Karen, you say here, practice perceptual repositioning. I love those words. Can you tell us a bit more about what that is? Practice perceptual, repositioning ourselves perhaps into the mindset of the other person, or coming to understand who and how they might be acting in that moment and why they might be acting in that way. Um, Really interesting. So you could use this KCG model. And of course, those who have certified on the call with us or watching the recording later might reflect on, how are you increasing empathy for yourself? Are you working on the cognitive side of empathy or on the emotive side of empathy? Or are you putting yourself into empathic action? So for those of you who are new, we talk about at 6 seconds that cognitive empathy, the I understand what you're going through kind of empathy, which doesn't always build trust. It's almost aligned to sympathy. And Josh Friedman, our CEO, has a great video on the difference between sympathy and empathy. If you want to check out the YouTube channel, he says that sympathy implies distance. I can be sympathetic towards someone, but I don't really know what they're going through. I'm not really in their shoes. Whereas when we are over here in empathy, then we are in their shoes. But that can be very cognitive. Likewise, we could have the sort of empathy where we really feel the feels with people. And the issue with that is that if I were a social worker or a counselor or a psychologist, then I'm going to be taking on too much of that feeling of others as well. So I need to move a little bit towards empathic action. Think about what social workers do when they're working with people, perhaps around the death of a loved one or a change in the family dynamic. They might have that cognitive empathy, a little bit of emotive empathy, but they move towards helping, towards action in the best possible way. And thanks for sharing, Karen, here. So you've said this is an exercise from mindfulness, integrated CBT training about putting yourself in someone else's shoes applied to specific situations. Great, great. Well, that might be a great practice that those watching tonight could also look at implementing in your own lives. I'll certainly look it up a little bit later. And thank you for that tip there. I mean, there's lots of different references that we can start to bring in, and mindfulness CBD training, mindfulness training, I'm sure really does help us to move in that direction. So maybe you see some parallels as well with this model, which is great. So remember that listening here is a key skill for empathy building. And as Francis Frey said before, that means less distraction. So that means putting away our mobile phones, for instance, when we're in a coaching call, or if we're in a leadership moment, not being distracted. I went to the doctor today to organize something, and halfway through he took a call, which of course doctors do. They're maybe important that he really needed to take that call, and so he did. But the point I make is that if it was a different moment and perhaps he were giving me a diagnosis, that would not be the point in the call to tell me or to take another call. So we've got to limit our distractions as well. Yeah, send me a PDF or link in with me, Karen, on LinkedIn. I'd love to connect with you a bit further on this idea. Maybe there's something that we can talk about in a further webinar. Thank you. Mensa, you've said here, I think both cognitive and emotive empathy should go hand in hand to balance the impact. Yes, you've made that point, and maybe you picked that up from the practitioner training you did in 2017. So 100%, it's a balance of both. So we do need to have the thinking part and the feeling part. But if they're out of balance, it can seem like we're too superficial with the cognitive, or we're too deep with someone, and then we're actually carrying their burdens with us as well. So we want to watch out for that as we're practicing empathy. There may be times for one or the other, but looking at that balance is clear. I'd like to share with you now another model that we have. I mentioned before, Chris, the VS model, and you said, what's that? It's the vital signs model. And it looks like this. We did a study back in 2013. We started the study that's now become this model and an assessment tool for us as well. Back in 2013, with over 100 organizations and 10,000 people. And we were looking at what are the factors that go into understanding performance within a workplace. And we came up with this model. So the model looks at the north-south axis, strategy versus operations. Where are we going? What is our direction? Versus how are we doing on a daily basis? And it looks on the east-west axis at organizations and people. So what are we doing for our people, but also our processes, the strategy, the systems that we have in place to support people. And there are a number of drivers on top of these directions. And you see there, trust is in the middle. So we have motivation, change, execution, and teamwork. And you can see there the way they move with those arrows. So if we're looking at strategy, we need motivation, change, and trust. If we're looking at organization, we need change and execution and trust. So trust really then is actually a combination of these four factors, and it forms this fulcrum in the model. So trust is at the center. And as we said before, in our business case, we understand that organizations that really are high performing have joy, are 22 times likely to be high performing because they've implemented trust and empathy and some of these factors as well. So in your workplace, I could ask you, if I were using this model with you, what is motivation like in your organization? What about our ability to change and our execution on those daily processes that we have within the organization? Are we getting the results that we'd like to? And is there a good basis for teamwork? Do we truly align as a team? And when we start to think about those, that when those are higher, trust is more likely to be higher in an organization as well. And when it comes to trust, again, besides honing in on our empathy, we can also think about a couple of pulse points. So within each of these factors of the model are several pulse points that I'd like to share with you tonight. And the first of these is transparency. And I say there, share more truth. So it's really about understanding how are we communicating. You may have heard of mirror neurons, which is a relatively recent finding in neuroscience that talks about the fact that what I'm putting out, you are receiving in terms of the neuronal activity that's happening in our brains. And so therefore, That's where people copy each other. That's where people understand. So if I'm sharing trust, if I'm developing and building trust within my organization as a leader, then others are going to receive that and reciprocate that. And it works backwards and forwards, both of us firing off those mirror neurons. It's also why we get so excited when we watch sports games. So if you're someone who loves seeing your favorite team win and you have and feel emotions, then that's what's happening. You're having those mirror neurons firing off. So think about those moments in your organization. When are you building trust with people? When do you build trust in your own lives? For me, I know that, I had a beautiful lunch today with my wife, and we don't always get to have lunch together. So we went to one of our favorite restaurants in Vienna, where I live here, and we shared a meal together. And we were just going back and forth. But then when we walked home, we held hands, and it was just one of those beautiful trust moments where we're both adding to each other's emotional bank accounts. And we know that we're building that. We're sharing in those moments. We're communicating in a way that's positive, that can help us both, really understand that we need to walk the talk, or we need to understand the talk before we can even get there. How we're communicating, how we're using emotional intelligence, being transparent in ourselves. So that also aligns a little bit to that word authenticity that we heard before. We need to be coherent. So coherence is our second pulse point. And it's talking about, are we living the values in our organization? I think this is another key aspect of trust. We often talk about, developing values, having values. Who of you can truly say that you have and live by your values, especially the workplace ones that we're given? Did you have a hand in creating the values that your workplace thinks about and uses? Some of our values, if you look at our website, they talk about learn, measure, and grow. So learning about EQ, measuring EQ, and growing our EQ. So as a practitioner myself, I need to walk that talk. I need to find moments where I'm challenged and I need to invest in my EQ. Maybe it's when I'm with my kids, I learn something about how to interact with other people in my workplaces. So coherence here is about our values and about, are we walking the talk on those values as well? The final factor to consider as a pulse point is care. And here's that word, connection, that we've already talked about earlier. Are we fostering genuine connection with others, which involves empathy? And Simon Sinek, in that talk that I mentioned before about performance and trust in his matrix, in a similar talk, talks about the fact that meeting in person, shaking hands. And I know many of us, including myself, work at 6 Seconds. It's a remote work environment. But we try 3 to 4 times a year to connect in person. And I say we try. So last year we connected twice in person. We were actually able to break bread with each other, to eat a meal, to shake hands, to be in presence, and to build trust in those moments as well. So how can you give someone a virtual handshake is the next question. And of course, there are ways and tools where we can start to recognize that this is helping us to connect, to actually check in with others. One great exercise I can give you actually is called an emotional check-in. So if you're on a remote work environment, it may be worth asking people, how are you feeling today? And there's a moment of authenticity. Take off that hat and say, yeah, I'm actually really struggling today. Or I'm here. It's been a busy moment with the family, but I'm here. Or I'm fighting fit, everything's going really well, and I'm ready for action. So when we understand as a leader that emotional temperature of the room, we can start to also have empathy and also connect with people in different ways. I often suggest in some of our certification that, is the moment to drop the latest company news about redundancies and layoffs going to be done in a room where everyone has said they're stressed and anxious and upset, and you can visibly see that people are in that moment? Hopefully not. So this is where, as a leader, we need to understand our own emotional intelligence. So these are our 3 pulse points that I'd like you to consider. And again, if you have any thoughts to add in as we go along, I welcome those. So how can we build empathy? How can we build trust in this way, as we've talked about authenticity, then competencies that we've just discussed, but now thinking about performance. It's all well and good to have theory, to understand the models, to maybe use these words on a daily basis, but how can we really enact trust? How can we move forward? So here's a tip from Dan Airley, whose TED Talk on trust talked about the fact that we need to share or could share embarrassing stories. So, have you been in an environment where perhaps you could share something that made you seem human? If you're a leader of an organization, why not? It doesn't have to be the most embarrassing thing you've ever done, but those little moments where you tripped up the stairs or you spilled coffee all over yourself or you've come to the meeting with all those things, don't try and hide it, embrace it and embrace those embarrassing moments that make us look human. This is one way to forge connection with others. Find other ways to connect. So I'd love to hear your thoughts, but finding connection can include things like, as I said before, meeting people in person, shaking hands, or elbow bumps and fist bumps and things like that. But being in the same room or presence as somebody, connecting face to face, going for that coffee where it's not always about work. People ask me as an Australian living in Europe, when you say hello, you don't really mean it, do you? And I often say, actually, I do. I do for the reason that if I ask someone, how are you? Then I'm able to, like I mentioned before, understand the emotional context of where someone is and where they're at. How far can I push them in this moment? Or do I need to stand back and just relax a little bit as well? Scott, I love here you've said vulnerability helps greatly too in building connection through relatability. Yeah, so these embarrassing stories are vulnerable moments where we need to consider, okay, yeah. And I'd almost say vulnerability needs to be with a capital V, another word to add to our collection of words here from earlier. So it could be an embarrassing story. It could be a sad moment in life. It could be a time there where you felt something in particular and sharing your emotions. You see here on my wall the Plutchik wheel of emotions, which if you look up 6 seconds Plutchik wheel, you can also see the way in which this model interacts. And we look at intensity of emotions as well. When I'm sharing those emotions, I'm actually helping myself name it to tame it. So I can actually start to either move through and navigate some of my own emotions. But in doing so, I'm building trust with others. They see me as vulnerable. That doesn't mean that I'm not a good leader. That actually works for me. Some of the literature points out that we actually build that trust. We grow closer with people, and we're not seen as sort of the person in the sky. I say here, find shared values. So it's all well and good for me to have my values and Scott to have his or others to have theirs. But where do we find common purpose? Where do we find a similarity? And that's what we need to discover through building. And I use this rock picture analogy here as an analogy towards finding those foundations of which then everybody else's moments and rocks can sit on. So if we have that common purpose underneath all that we do, so that 6 seconds, for instance, we are all about building community. That's why we have these webinars and we welcome you to join in on other things that you could do in the future with us. Some of you are already part of the network. It's great that you've come maybe from parts of the US or in other countries, and here you are in a European webinar. Welcome. It's great. And that's what we love about this idea of our network. But we all come from that point of wanting to and sharing in that emotional intelligence is important. And it's something that can be practiced and it's something that can be learned. And we can learn to build trust with others, finding connection. The last area here I put is team building. And I also work as a lecturer, and I've been doing a class on team building and intercultural management. And this is where understanding each other, especially in this cross-cultural world that we live in, is now, I think, more and more important. I come with my values from an Australian living in Europe and have many moments of culture clash. But Others come from other places in the world, and we mix together. So, how do we build our teams and what can we do? And I love that in this picture, maybe hard for you to see, but these people, I think, are all making wreaths. It looks like a sort of Christmas time activity, and they're making wreaths out of branches. Now, maybe that's not for Christmas, maybe it's just for some other part of the year. Maybe it was a wreath making project and somebody is an expert in that and brought their skill. So, what better way to build a team than for you to share something and then for others to participate in that as well? We get to learn about our person who's leading that, but we also get to come together and we can have an experience. Same with food. I was told by somebody very early on in my career who said, I've always connected people with food. And in various guises that I've been in, including with 6 Seconds, when we all met, we went on a retreat last year for a few days and we met over food, over breakfast, over lunch, over dinner. We were all sitting in different places and connecting and meeting people as we started to build our new team. There may be other team building activities that you could do. It could be, I mentioned before, asking people to share how they're feeling. Another great idea is to use check-in questions. And there's a great AI app called DareSay that asks you different questions. So start your meeting with a check-in question. That moment of investment, might be 5 minutes of your meeting, is going to help you to connect, to build trust, and to find out a little bit more about others. And in doing so, we become a little bit more vulnerable. And of course, like before was mentioned, we do it to our boundary of feeling comfortable. We're not asking people to share, intimate details, but these types of questions can help us to just open up in a little bit of a new direction as well. So are there any other ways that you can think about how we can find connection with others, share those values? Maybe you have an embarrassing story to share. So before we finish up tonight, I'd like to also think about how we can listen and learn as really a summary, and how can we avoid distractions from our phones, from the noisy environments that we're working in, from even just the work that we have, from ourselves. We're often distracted as well. We have so many priorities now. I haven't met anyone recently who's not busy moving in multiple directions. So we need to think about how can we give more immediate focus to people. One offer I'd like to make for you today, for those of you who are on the call and perhaps have not partaken in a Say Leadership report, this is one way in which we can measure empathy. As I said, here at 6 Seconds, we learn, which hopefully you have something, one or two things tonight, we can measure, and then through our network and community, we grow together. And so the Say Leadership report, you can see here a sample profile, is one way in which you could, through coaching, through one of our certified coaches or through one of our network, you could actually have this particular report. It will cost money, of course, but you could talk to your certified person. So if you're interested, then please do get in contact with me, perhaps on LinkedIn, or I'll pop in my email address at the end for you as well. But this report is an in-depth look at all those competencies that we saw before. This is actually my report on screen, and you can see here my different levels back in October last year of where I was for all different things. And so I know, therefore, my empathy is at a certain level, but I can also improve that. And then I can talk with my coach about what I might do on a daily basis or a weekly basis or even a monthly basis about what I could do to improve my empathy or any other of the competencies of emotional intelligence. Because as we know from our research, that when we work on these competencies, we're more likely to improve our organizations because we become high performing. And then we also spread. One of the key ideas of EQ is that emotions are contagious. So I really encourage you to spread emotions, perhaps the more pleasant ones versus the unpleasant ones, but really thinking about how can you help others? How can you invest a little bit more time to lift, to connect? Another way you could help yourself is through our Unlocking Emotional Intelligence course, which is our first course and a really nice starter course in some of our other models and some nice exercises and some theory and some ideas. And I think a couple of you have already participated in that course as well, if I look back through the notes here. So Chris, yes, you said that you're an unlocking facilitator and coach as well. So perhaps you've done this course or you're leading this course. Either way, really seeing how we can understand and take those first few steps together. So whether you're just in the journey or a newbie, as some of you are, or whether you're well versed in this content and area, it's really thinking about how do we apply these skills. So all over and all up, these areas are helping us to understand and build trust. So remember, being authentic, understanding the competencies that we've worked in, and also looking at performance or really practicing to perform, practicing to improve our performance. It is a daily practice that we want to invest in. So whether you start to use check-in questions, connect with others, share embarrassing and vulnerable moments with others, or consider other types of team building, then I would encourage you to do so. Join our community. So I see a few newer names here, people I haven't met before. I welcome you to reach out to me. So I'll type my email address here into the chat for you. If you'd like to find out more about 6 Seconds here in Europe, I'd be happy to share with you more information about our courses, but also on our LinkedIn site. Perhaps you saw this through our LinkedIn 6 Seconds Europe group. So there's also our global community, but we have many other events here in Europe that are happening that are allowing you to come and be part of the community. We really welcome you because then you can take those ideas and share them from there. So this is really coming to the conclusion so that we finish on time. I wanted to leave just a couple of moments for anyone who has a question. Thank you for those who are writing some other lovely thoughts here. You're very welcome, Karen. It's a pleasure to thank you for sharing your time as well. So I'd be happy to connect with you if you'd like to, and Alberto as well. Thank you for your thoughts there as well. And yeah, please take one or two things with you that can be helpful. And that would be my wish for you tonight in terms of building trust with others. So I may end the recording now, but really thanking all of you. To those of you also who are watching on afterwards, please get in touch, and we do hope that you've enjoyed.